Good morning. You're watching a home broadcast of Business World Live. I'm Danny Laurel. It's 10:37 a.m. this Thursday morning. We're about an hour into our shortened trading day. Let's kick off with our top story. Now, with a quarter of the year already in the books and data trickling in, we are starting to get a glimpse of how bad the pandemic is, as well as how the measures to contain it are now impacting our economy. The latest we have on that is of PESA approved investment showing an almost 30% drop in the first quarter. Now, that is actually because the board was not able to meet at all when the Luzon-wide community quarantine was declared in mid-March. So they were not able to approve any of the investments. But actually, even before the lockdown, the numbers were not exactly promising. The first 2 months of the year already showed a more than 5% drop in approved investments. You're going to be seeing on your screens here, the PESA registered companies employ almost 1.6 million workers. That's 6% higher than the number from last year. But of the 1,749 firms, just over 1,000 are at least partially operating because export-oriented and outsourcing businesses are still allowed to operate, but only 38 of those are fully operational. Now, PESA Director General Charito Plaza says the Sitira bill is the other reason investments were drying up, and now the Finance Department is thinking of modifying the bill to allow more incentives to be granted. The goal, though, is to allow government to tailor-fit incentive schemes, especially to companies hit hard by the lockdowns. The bill, which aims to lower the corporate income tax to 20% while changing how the government grants tax incentives and relief, is still pending in Congress right now, which is not scheduled to resume session until May 4th. Let's kick off with our markets on the home front as our local index strengthens by 1.2% this Thursday morning, back above 5,600 levels. Here, recall that we had closed at around 5,500 levels, so we are back above that. 5643.04 is how we are faring right now. Now, this after we saw 3 straight days of declines yesterday. We closed down 0.3%. But this was on the back of net foreign selling continuing. So it seems that whether or not we, end the day in the green, in the red, the net foreign selling is one clear picture here. Yesterday, we lost again 236 million pesos. That's a 26th straight day of an exodus. Now, Chris Mangon of AAA Equities, though, is saying that, we might be taking more chances here, especially for investors. We might be seeing a higher end towards the end of the week. Now, one other thing to be watching out for here is oil, especially since this might have caused jitters still yesterday. That has now recovered. WTI closing in at 19% higher. And very quick peek here on how that moved on and spilled over, that positivity of oil at least recovering, spilling over into the rest of the equity markets globally. You've got the US actually seeing gains here. Let's take a quick peek at Asia Pac and how that is performing. Not recovering from yesterday. You're going to be seeing Japan up by 0.7%, but Hang Seng and the rest of China, a very mixed picture here. So a lot of things to be watching out here. I just wanted to do a quick peek on how our sectors are performing and which ones are in the green this morning. So a very quick peek on that. We'll show you a little bit of a mixed picture here. You're going to be seeing holding firms up by 0.3%, financials leading the charge up by 2.4%, but still a couple of sectors, no sectors actually in the red, all of them with some gains, but financials leading the charge here. So we're going to be checking back in on our markets and stocks specifically later on in the broadcast. Let's move on to other headlines we're watching this Thursday. Now, about 50 of the world's major exporters will be signing a pledge to ensure adequate global food supply as the pandemic continues to force disruptions in supply chains. The agreement seeks restraint from officials regarding any rash trade restrictions that may arise due to the uncertainty caused by this virus outbreak. Now, among those who are joining this pledge are the EU, Japan, Canada, and Brazil. Now, the Philippines, Hong Kong, and Singapore are also among the participants. As of Tuesday, US, China, India, and Russia had not signed on to this initiative, but the agreement recommends a set of 8 policy actions, including keeping supply chains open and connected, avoiding unjust trade restrictions, and ensuring emergency bans are targeted, proportionate, and temporary. Now, though the measures are not binding, the pact is considered an important move in ensuring the pandemic does not cause a food emergency. Over the past month, at least a dozen countries have imposed COVID 19 related export bans on agricultural products. The World Trade Organization has since agreed that export restrictions would adversely affect food availability and cause price increases, volatility, and shortage in food items. Now, more business leaders in Asia are keeping a rather pessimistic outlook on the economy. That's amid the COVID 19 outbreak. The latest global survey by international business group YPO states that 15% of chief executives from North and Southeast Asia consider their business under severe threat and are at risk of not surviving the pandemic. Now, that is compared to 11% of other global CEOs who likewise have a bleak outlook for this year. Asian business leaders also expect a drop in revenues, about half of them seeing at least a 20% decline. However, they're slightly more optimistic on employee count and retention that's compared to other global leaders. All in all, 60% of chief executives expect a U-shaped recovery following the pandemic. Almost two-thirds expect negative effects on revenues to persist at least a year from now. Now, that survey was conducted last week, drawing insights from over 3,000 chief executives over 100 countries. Now, the House Economic Stimulus Subcommittee released a draft bill that is to help workers and businesses recover from the COVID 19 outbreak. Now, the House body is calling for a 613 billion peso stimulus package for this recovery strategy. This draft bill is called the Philippines Recovery Act, and it classifies economic measures to address the COVID 19 as transitional, sectoral, and structural interventions. Now, transitional interventions, these are economic relief measures to be implemented immediately after the lockdown to avoid permanent damage to the economy. These include, for instance, wage subsidies worth 110 billion pesos for critical businesses, the self-employed, freelancers, and also OFWs. You've also got a 1 billion peso compensation that will be provided by the SSS and the GSIS for the COVID 19 victims. Sectoral interventions, meanwhile, are the relief measures intended for MSMEs, tourism establishments, farms, and fishing communities, and other critical businesses. And finally, you've got structural interventions. These include 48 billion pesos worth of credit mediation and refinancing, 300 billion pesos in zero interest loans to businesses by the Land Bank and DBP, and 650 billion pesos for enhancing the Build program. Now, is this the economic plan or recovery plan that we actually need right now? Here to chime in with her thoughts on that, we have with us Dr. Toby Melissa Monsod. She's an associate professor at the University of the Philippines School of Economics. Hello, ma'am, and thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Hi. Hi, good morning, Dan.
Very quick reaction to that package. Are you happy with that? Is this exactly what we need? Could they have done more? Is this the best that we could hope for right now?
I think it's a good start. I think that it clearly indicates which parts are basically still relief measures. And, for as long as some of those loans are very short term, then, you can minimize on any moral hazard problems and so forth. The part that I really appreciate is the enhanced BBB. I think if they can pull that off in terms of really rethinking the infrastructure that we need under a new normal, right? Because it's not obvious that we should just revert back to what was planned before. I'm a little worried about this National Emergency Investment Corporation. It's not very clear why government should go in that way. No, that's the problem I have. I don't know enough about it, but for me it's a warning signal.
Okay, ma'am. Just a follow up on that because I really want to get your economic input on that. Finance Secretary Sunny Dominguez says we only have the fiscal measures or the money basically until a May lockdown. So after that, wala nang pera, diba? And we've also got some analysts, for instance, from Templeton saying that emerging markets like the Philippines, we don't have as much fiscal stimulus as other developed economies that can help us, pull through or that can afford an extended period of a lockdown. Do you agree with that?
I think that statement assumes that funds for fiscal stimulus is coming from either tax revenues or borrowings or existing cash, right? But as we pointed out in a previous paper, the Banco Central has a very powerful tool. It can create money, and that is something that can be wielded during this time. So it's not clear why there is a deadline up to
Okay.
May as to how cash, up to when cash will last when you have possible interventions from the Banco Central.
But ma'am, even if there's more liquidity, for example, there's more available loans, cheaper loans if the interest rates are lower, will people be tapping those loans? Will there not be a lag? If businesses stop spending,
Yeah.
they're scared to be cash
Yeah.
strapped. Is there
No,
going to be a stimulus useful?
first of all, if we're still talking about, because Secretary Dominguez was talking about a lockdown until May, so I'm assuming that we're talking about lockdown conditions, right? And
Okay.
whether or not we can, well, even in the aftermath, 2 months after the lockdown, whether or not government can continue to provide food support and so forth, no, social protection. And in our view, the Banco Central, when it creates money, it can actually um, uh, like what it's already doing. No, it can create money for use by the Treasury, in which case that money need not be spent through loans. This is direct expenditures by the government, right? So that's one
Okay.
avenue. If they create money in order to provide liquidity to banks, so that banks are, yes, there will be, you need something more so that banks will indeed use that money, and also that SMEs will avail of that money. Because even before COVID, there were obstacles to that happening. But I think from an expenditure viewpoint, if you're talking about funding an expenditure program, the Banco Central can support this by creating money.
Okay. Ma'am, let's take a step back as we await the decision on whether this ECQ in Luzon will be continued or there will be some sort of modified, community quarantine. Just your thoughts on the past 5 weeks and whether this has been effective in any way to contain the virus. Have we been doing everything?
I think to the extent that the lockdown prevented a collapse of the health system, to the extent that the lockdown bought time for the health system to prepare itself more, then yes, because the health system has really gained a lot during this time, right? Has it gained enough? That is the question. Has it prepared itself enough to start lifting the lockdown? That's the second question. And I think that can only be answered by looking at whether LGUs and the national government are prepared with testing facilities, diba, quarantining facilities, isolation facilities. In our view, of course, between quarantine, isolating, and testing, it's the testing capacity that is going to be key here. And so the protocols for testing will be very important. It will determine what kind of capacity you also need, right? So that is where our second paper was going.
Yes, we want to press you on that because that's a
Okay.
very important counterpoint, diba?
Yeah.
The government is saying they're doing everything for diagnostic testing. The kits have been expensive. It's not something that they can just do for everyone. I mean, in an ideal world, everyone asymptomatic and with symptoms could be tested. But you're saying that there's a different approach that can be done to testing and
No.
not necessarily mass testing. Can you explain your position?
Yeah, okay. So I think there's some confusion, right? Mass testing is being used synonymously with the approach that DOH now is taking. DOH is really doing testing for diagnosis purposes, right? It tests people who are manifesting symptoms, health workers as well, and close contacts. The purpose of that test is to determine whether or not treatment must be given. Okay.
Okay.
What we're talking about is if we're limiting our knowledge of the disease to the results of those diagnostic tests, we're really not getting a full picture of the behavior of the disease in our country. Okay? Because the only ones you're sampling basically are those that are symptomatic. And so estimates based on that may be incomplete, even unreliable, to tell us whether or not the curve is flattening, and so forth. As it is now, we don't really have a handle on whether or when a second wave of infection can happen, or a third wave, right? And so we're saying that while testing capacity has limited DOH to diagnostic testing, we really have to expand testing coverage and undertake surveillance testing. Okay, surveillance testing will mean that you're sampling, you're testing people that represent the population. Okay,
Okay.
and we think that an economical way to doing that, because of course, if you're going to apply the gold standard, use the gold standard test for that, would be very expensive.
Right.
We're saying that you can go sample-based random testing, and you can begin with the rapid test, the
Okay.
rapid antibody test. Yeah.
So you're saying that the government can actually afford something like this, and have you seen it? Is this study, patterning it from another country that has been successful in this compared to just the diagnostic testing, for example?
Right. I think different countries have approached it differently, and they also have different capacities. So you can see in South Korea and so forth, they are able to do the RT-PCR test and so forth. Countries, I understand that countries have scientists in different countries have also pointed out the need to do surveillance testing. Now, I'm sorry, what was that? I think that the key here, you're asking whether or not we have money for it. Well,
Yes.
the private sector is actually willing, is actually planning to do the rapid antibody test, right?
Okay.
And we're saying that here is a possible approach where you can optimize these investments so that we can really have some sense of the behavior of the disease in the population. And so we describe in our paper this two-level approach, right? But the bottom line is, for the rapid antibody-based test, we do believe that it is affordable, as the first level. And then for if there are cases that are identified as positive, that is when you move to the gold standard. And even using the gold standard, there may be a way to be more cost effective.
Okay. Ma'am, is this a precondition for you to say that the economy can reopen? And is this a precondition to what you're proposing as a sectoral reopening of the economy versus, a barangay level type of gradual lifting?
Yeah, well, the default now is the geographical approach. We talked about that in an earlier paper, and that really has to proceed. And in fact, it precedes the sectoral approach. A sectoral approach is an overlay of that, because while you can open barangays and lift restrictions on movement within cities, the question becomes, how about economic sectors that crisscross LGU boundaries, right? How can you manage the opening of sectors in a safe way, or in a way that is as safe as possible? And so we suggest that, we suggested the classification of sectors, and we said that if you classify them in these 4 ways, actually 3 of those
Okay.
clusters can already open. Um,
Can you
uh,
specify this to our viewers, ma'am? Which
I'm sorry.
clusters? Can you
No,
specify clusters?
we sort of categorized sectors according to whether they were high with high importance or low importance to sustaining the economy over 18 months. 18
Okay.
months was our timetable because we're assuming that maybe by 18 months a vaccine will be there, right? A vaccine will be available. So the question is, what do you do up to that time? Okay.
Okay.
So we classified sectors according to importance to sustaining the economy, as well as to the occupations, whether the occupations are high risk or low risk in terms of spreading the virus. And we came up with four economic clusters. Well, we just labeled them simply A, B, C, and D. But the first cluster is, the family agricultural workers who are farming for consumption. The second one are the second cluster is the food and agricultural production sector, banking, finance, BPOs. These are high importance to the economy over the next 18 months, as well as low risk spreaders, meaning
Okay.
the degree of client contact is not as great, right? Then we have the sector of high risk and high importance. These are the logistics, transportation networks, distribution networks, public works, construction, and so forth. Um, and the last one is the uh, uh, low importance and high risk spreaders. These are the malls, the theaters, and so forth. Now, this last one is the one that we're saying restrictions should be kept imposed, right? There's no urgency in terms of opening these up. Work at home arrangements can be kept and so forth. The other three sectors, we're saying these can open for as long as sample-based random testing is undertaken.
Okay, so there you have it, Professor Monsod from the UP School of Economics. Thank you, ma'am. She is, of course, saying that there might be another approach that is convergent, actually, with the LGU Barangay approach, and that is a sectoral approach categorized in four different clusters depending on the amount of risk of opening that sector and the importance to our
Yeah.
local economy. Thank you so much for those insights, ma'am.
Okay.
That
Thank
is
you.
a first. Thank you, ma'am. And that is a first look into the business day. Today is Thursday, April 23rd, 2020. Thank you so much for watching. Catch us again tomorrow, 10:30 a.m. I'm Danny Laurel, and we are One News.